Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover on this infamous spectacle at the Vatican that was held by the Baku regime. Then we're going to segue into what are the best ways to actually attack the entire propaganda system of this regime, and using this case as an example of how to isolate and attack the regime. And we will close with the Trump administration's non-use of the word genocide when marking the commemoration of the Armenian genocide last week. Recently, a conference was organized at the Vatican titled Christianity in Azerbaijan, History and Modernity. This was organized by the Baku International Center for Multiculturalism, the Azerbaijani Embassy to the Holy See, and obviously it was organized directly with the Vatican powers that be. This was likely authorized by the Vatican in exchange for a large contribution by the Heydar Aliyev Foundation to secure the marble cladding of the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls. Before we start tearing all of this apart, we have to understand where this comes from. Obviously, this is a long-term project to cover up the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, and that's moved on to the cultural destruction of Artsakh, that is to de-Armenize all of the Armenian cultural monuments there. And what better organization to use as a cover than the Catholic Church, which is obviously one of the oldest Christian organizations in the world and known internationally as the face of Christianity to most people who are not Christians.
Salam askar.
If you look at the dealings between the Vatican and the regime going back to 2014, it's obviously a systematic long-term effort to use the Vatican for these purposes. Now, what's been the response to this? The Armenian Church has actually responded very well. They've been very vigorous on all fronts attacking this conference. The response from the Armenian government has been very weak. From what we understand, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the ambassador didn't even know that this was going to happen, which is quite amazing, given the size that the Vatican is the size of a postage stamp. And they have not said anything following this conference, I'm assuming not to jeopardize the imaginary peace deal. Now let's start tearing this apart. We can all be quite sure that the Apostle Paul must be thrilled that the basilica that was dedicated to him is being repaired by a contribution from a foundation named after an ex-KGB agent and Politburo member. Both of those institutions killed millions of Christians, including Catholics. Secondly, who can take an event seriously that is organized by the Baku International Center for Multiculturalism, which is likely housed next to the Baku Center for Human Rights. The reality, however, is that this particular project, this event, was a failure since no serious scholars attended or even took it seriously. And the only media coverage that it's had is negative coverage in the international Catholic press and in the Armenian one. For anyone who's actually outraged by this, it probably means that you're quite naive, because frankly, no one should have any moral expectations of the Vatican, just on the face of it. If you want to sort of understand what happened here, was probably a couple of really clever cardinals in the Vatican that conned regime officials in Baku to make large contributions for a construction project that they wanted to finish, while at the same time filling their own personal pockets with large bribes from the regime, which they have no problem giving away. And all of this in exchange for a plaque on another Vatican tourist trap that no one will ever read. And if they could actually read the plaque, they could not pronounce the name of the person who actually made the contribution, and a silly conference that went with it that has actually given them nothing but bad press. I would say we should never discourage such behavior. I would encourage Vatican officials to go back to the regime in Baku and ask to rename St. Peter's Basilica St. Ilham Basilica for a modest contribution of $10 billion. On a more serious note, the extent of the Azeri money corrupting the Vatican must be enormous, given the fact that the Vatican was entirely silent during the ethnic cleansing in 23 of our Armenians of Artsakh, and it's been entirely silent about the systematic destruction of Christian monuments all over Artsakh that the regime has been carrying out. And that silence most likely has been purchased. And that's actually the type of silence that we see from the Vatican, only in its defense of pedophile priests. Moving on to sort of best ways to take on regime propaganda and her proxies. I have to tell you, from an organizer's perspective, what the regime and the Vatican have handed us is absolutely fantastic. Because up to now, if you look at their level of corruption, it's usually second-rate think tankers in Washington, D.C., or third-rate European MPs that have been bought and paid for, actually 2 of them in Germany in trial right now, even lower-scale press from around the world. The Vatican, that is being corrupted by the Azeri regime right now is actually the biggest fish that they have ever caught. And that's where the opportunity comes in. It's very hard to outline regime corruption when you're talking about marginal figures in Washington and other places, while the Vatican is the oldest continually operating political institution in the Western world today. It obviously gets endless press attention, especially given this year that we're going to have a new pope that's going to be elected. Also, given the very secular nature of the press in the West, they love negative stories about the Vatican, or actually religion in general. And to attack the Vatican is actually quite normal for them. As you know, in any organizing campaign, half of it is putting your enemy on the map. In this case, the Vatican does not need that. The Vatican corruption case in this can be made into COP29 2.0, in which an international event and the regime's element and just basic instinct to try to corrupt it is something that can be used to hang the regime and all of her proxies. All of this at the same time, when in fact there's lots of rank and file Catholics, real practicing Catholics, that are quite sympathetic to Armenia and Armenians and are disgusted by all of this. And what's important here is actually to make an example of everyone involved in this case by battering them, essentially outing all the whores and essentially telling all the future whores the price to be paid if they associate with the regime. And frankly, there's no better candidate in doing that than the Vatican. I can tell you from my own public relations background, the reality is it is not very hard to attack this regime or tear apart their schemes for very simple reasons, since all of their efforts, for the most part, die under the sunshine of public light. The regime and her proxies do not like public exposure that they do not control or they buy. And once, I'm convinced, once that the proxies are under attack, they will take the money and drop the regime in 2 seconds. Overall, the regime in Baku, if you study them from a public relations perspective, have a great capacity to buy things, i.e. things behind closed doors, especially with compromised people, but they have no capacity to build things, which is actually quite typical of totalitarian states. What is necessary from our side, both on the state and non-state sectors, and if the state is not willing to do it, non-state sectors can do it, is a complete systematic program to press them on all fronts. Now let's move on to the Trump non-recognition of the Armenian genocide. What happened last week is, unlike President Biden, which for the past 4 years, when making the yearly commemoration statement, remembering the Armenian genocide, he used the word genocide in both 4 years of his presidency. Donald Trump went back to what all US presidents used to do, use մեծ եղել and other euphemisms without using the word genocide. Obviously, this is disappointing, but frankly, it is not surprising. Most likely, from what we've heard, this came from either a phone call from Erdogan to President Trump or other Turkish pressure on him not to do so. We know that there's a very distinct special relationship between President Donald Trump and the dictator from Ankara. In some ways, I think Trump envies the powers that Erdogan has as far as being able to put his enemies to jail and all these things.
Well, I have great relations with a man named Erdogan. Have you heard of him? And I happen to like him, and he likes me, and I know the press will get very angry. He likes Erdogan, but I do, and he likes me, and we've never had a problem, and we've gone through a lot.
Moving on, the U.S. at this point, frankly, has become a complete outlier when it comes to human rights matters. You know, it's now routinely votes in the United Nations with the Eritreas and the Belaruses and the North Koreas of the world. So the U.S. is hardly a standard on matters like this. But given all of the things that are going on in the world, with this administration specifically, this is really not the hill that you want to die on. What matters for us when it comes to this administration is their continual pressure on the regime in Baku against any aggressions against us, which we know for a fact is quite real. The implementation of the Strategic Partnership Program, especially when it comes to energy and defense matters. And the big prize, which from what the rumors that we're hearing might be around the corner, is the authorization of weapons purchases for Armenia from the United States. And let's be honest, does anybody really believe that Donald Trump even knows what the Armenian genocide is, who actually get mad with him over not using the G word? That is a man who likely knows very little about what happened in his own country in 1915, much less what happened in Armenia in 1915. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.
I offered to help you. You refused to take our money. Then I said, I guess you're really up shit creek.
Ow!
Christ, Jake, take it easy, man.
Elwood! Oh, Jesus Christ! Ow! Jesus Christ! Ah, shit! Fuck you, bitch! Hey! Jesus Christ! Oh, you fat penguin! Fuck this noise, man!
You're such a disappointing pair. I prayed so hard for you. It saddens and hurts me that the two young men whom I raised to believe in the 10 Commandments have returned to me as two thieves with filthy mouths and bad attitudes.